Today is July 12th. It is the feast of Saint Paisios. Paisios is a relatively new saint in the church. When I say a new saint, he's not really a new saint. He's newly recognized in the church. The church put him on the calendar in 2015. So he's one of the more recently canonized saints in the church. He was born in 1924, 2 years after my dad. So he's kind of in our time. And he died in 1994. So relatively recently. He's from Greece. As a little boy, he had a desire to be a monk. But his parents told him, no, grow up, and then you can do what you want to do with your life. He wanted to go even to a monastery when he was a little boy. He was named actually Arsenios, and it was his priest, Father Arsenios, who named the boy, who named him Arsenios. He said, I want him named after me. I've never done that, by the way. I've never told a parent, this is what you're going to do, but this is what he did. Father Arsenios, he told the parents of St. Paisios, I want you to name him Arsenios. So they did. And Arsenios, Father Arsenios, the priest who baptized him, said to his parents, someday he is going to be a great saint of the church. Now this Father Arsenios, his priest, actually also ended up being canonized as a saint in the church. And so we have Saint Arsenios of Cappadocia, who is the priest who baptized little Arsenios, who would become Saint Paisios. He served in World War II in the Greek army, and he was a radio operator in the war. And it's interesting, if you read his writings, and there are actually many, many writings of Saint Paisios later on, because he was at a monastery and he was in charge of some other monasteries, and he would always write letters to these other monasteries and to a lot of people, because people used to flock to him for advice. And a lot of times he would use imagery from his experience in the army. He'd talk about being a radio operator and how our prayers are like our speaking, our radios to God, and God hears us, but we have to have that connection. How he worked on making that connection right in the army, and how we have to work to make that connection out in our own spiritual lives. In 1950, he went to Mount Athos for about 8 years, and he was a monk there. So that would make him about 26 years old when he went to Mount Athos. Mount Athos is a mountain range near Greece, and it is filled with many, many monasteries. It is really the monastic capital of the Orthodox world. And so we have many saints that have come from Mount Athos. It has a reputation. And so some people who really have this desire to grow in the monastic life, they choose to go to Mount Athos and join one of the monasteries that are there. People can visit Mount Athos. Has anybody here ever been to Mount Athos? So it's actually only men can go to Mount Athos. So it's only men's monasteries, and it's kind of an island. It's really more of a peninsula than an island, but it's kind of long, and the other end of it, you take a ferry to get to Mount Athos. And so this men's monastic community almost operates like its own country, its own state. And so Arsenios went to Mount Athos in 1950. He was tonsured a monk. Being tonsured is kind of like being ordained. It's not the same as being ordained. When you're ordained to be a deacon or a priest or a bishop, the bishop ordains you, and then you are that deacon, priest, or bishop. Becoming a monk is not becoming a priest or a deacon or a bishop. It's becoming a monk. So monks are not priests. Monks are monks. Now, a monk could become a priest if he's ordained a priest, but most monks are just monks. They are not priests, they're not bishops, they're not deacons. Every monastery has a few priests and deacons within them so that they can do the services. But if a monastery has, let's say, 50 people in the monastery, maybe there'll be 3 or 4 priests and 3 or 4 deacons, and the rest will not be ordained clergy. Saint Paisios, or Arsenios, then he became tonsured, and oftentimes when a monk becomes tonsured, their name is changed, and he became Paisios. He took on the name of Paisios and became Father Paisios. He wasn't a priest, but he was a monk. And he never got ordained priest. His whole life, he did not want to become a priest. He wanted to stay a monk. He was there for 8 years. The people from his hometown, his village, begged him to come home because at this time there was a large group of evangelical Christians who came to his town and started trying to convert all the people in his village to Protestantism, and they begged him to come down because they didn't know how to explain the faith like they knew their former Arsenios, now Father Paisios, like he could do. So he ended up coming back home for 8 years. And he taught the people, and he spent a lot of time with his people. Then he went back to Mount Athos years later. Eventually, he became involved in the Panaguda Hermitage of the Kutlumusiu Monastery, and he lived there for 15 years. I had to have that written down. That's a mouthful. And so he remained there for 50 years, and while he was there, as a monk, not a priest, he sat where you sat or stood in the area where you are during the Divine Liturgy. And so while he was there, he just focused on growing in his spiritual life. And his spiritual life really did grow, not only within him, but other people noticed it. The words that he shared with others, the advice that he gave was incredible and beautiful, and people were just drawn to him. He even started saying things that were prophetic in nature, telling people what they needed to do in their life, what their sins were, that they should go home to their priest, people, especially pilgrims that were visiting Mount Athos, that they should go home to their priest and go to confession, and these are the things you need to confess. Even when they hadn't quite said those things to St. Paisios, he knew ahead of time. He was amazing at taking difficult concepts and saying little stories that made them very understandable. And one of the things he really focused on, which is something I want to share with you today, is what's called philotimo. Philotimo. This is a Greek word. It has 2 parts to it. Philo, which means love, which you probably know. We get the word philosophy, love of wisdom. Philanthropy. Does anybody know what philanthropy means? What the roots are? We know it means to give money to good causes, philanthropy. But the word really means philo, the love, and anthropos, humanity. So philanthropy means love of humanity. And so when someone is philanthropic, It's because they have a love for other people. So philotimos in timi means honorable. So philotimo, this word I'm sharing with you this morning, means a love of what is honorable, a love of what is good. And this theme, philotimo, of St. Paisios pervades everything he does. It reminded me of Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, where St. Paul wrote to the Philippians, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Philotimo, the love of the honorable, the love of the good, doing things because it's good to do it. It means out of deep gratitude a person loves and lives, striving to think, to say, and to do what is honorable, acting out of love, kindness, modesty, responsibility, having a desire to suffer for others because you want to see good in their life, loyalty, dignity, an unselfish living, a living to build up others. It's getting more satisfaction from giving rather than from taking. It's a selflessness that's guided by love. And to finish this morning's thoughts on St. Paisios, so let me mention that eventually people would come and just want to visit with him. He would have lines and lines of people wanting to speak with him, pilgrims that would visit Mount Athos that had heard of him. He became known as Elder Paisios. Long before he was recognized in the church as Saint Paisios, I knew him as Elder Paisios. I never met him, I've never been to Mount Athos, but I had met people who had gone to Mount Athos and had met Elder Paisios. And some people would say, "Oh my goodness, the man is incredible. If you are able to go visit with Elder Paisios." And so, because of the pilgrims that would come to him, he generally got no more than 3 hours of sleep a night. He would say his prayers throughout the day and visit with people and go to church services, and that became his life, especially in the later years of his life. And he died in 1994. In 2015, so that's 21 years later, the church recognized him as a saint in the church. And we have his icon on the icon stand. So as you leave today, make sure you take a little look at the icon of St. Paisios. So I wanted to share with you a couple of his words. This is recounting a childhood memory. And in this section, this passage here, he talks about philotimo. He talks about this love of the honorable that motivated him. So these are his words now, translated obviously. "When I was a child and my soul was still pure, I loved Christ very much. I used to walk in the woods carrying a cross in my hands, chanting and praying and wishing to become a monk. My parents told me that I should first grow up and then leave to go to the monastery. One day, as I was taking my usual walk in the woods, I met a fellow villager. When he saw me carrying the cross, he asked me, 'What is this?' 'The cross of our Christ,' I replied. Since he didn't have any positive thoughts in his mind, he said to me, 'Arsenios, you are silly. You don't mean to say that you believe in God. He doesn't exist. These religious stories are made up by some priests. Christ was simply a man like all of us.' When he finished, he got up and left. His twisted thoughts filled my innocent soul with black, heavy clouds. Being alone in the woods, I began to think that maybe God doesn't exist. As I was feeling confused and desperate, I asked Christ to give me an indication of his existence so I could believe in him. But he did not respond. Feeling exhausted, I lay on the ground to rest. Suddenly, a positive thought, full of philotimo, entered my innocent soul. Hold on for a second. Wasn't Christ the kindest man ever on earth? No one has ever found anything evil in him. So whether he's God or not, I don't care. Based on the fact that he is the kindest man on earth, and I haven't known anyone better, I will try to become like him and absolutely obey everything the gospel says. I will even give my life for him, if needed, since he is so kind. All my thoughts of disbelief disappeared, and my soul was filled with immense joy. The power of my philotimo, this loving thought of goodness, the power of my philotimo thought dissolved all the confusing thoughts. When I started believing in Christ and decided to love him as much as I could, solely out of philotimo, I experienced a miracle that firmly sealed my grateful thought. Then I thought, I don't care anymore if someone tells me that God doesn't exist. He continues, we should not look for miracles, but rather trust our feeling of philotimo, as it is the key which opens the door to every good. The righteous Christian does not practice good acts for his own benefit, that is, in order to be rewarded or to avoid hell and gain paradise, but rather because he prefers good to evil. Everything else is a natural consequence of the good that fills our soul without having asked for it. So St. Paisios lived his life with this idea of philotimo. What is the good thing to do? What is the loving thing to do? And not doing the loving thing because that's what God wants and he'll like me better if I do the loving thing, but the loving thing because it's loving. And not only did he choose to do that, but doing that strengthened his faith. It caused the doubts to fade away. There's a wonderful podcast that you can see, I think it's on Ancient Faith, called Be the Bee. Anybody hear of Be the Bee before? A few of you have heard of Be the Bee. So the way this is spelled, Be the Bee is, this is English by the way, Be the Bee is B-E, the B-E-E, okay, as in a honeybee. Be the Bee. And this is a wonderful podcast that uses this kind of theme of philotimo and St. Paisios' ability to tell short stories and convey a spiritual thought. And it's made mostly for kids. There's maybe, I don't know, a couple hundred episodes there that you can watch. And while it's made for kids, Steve Cristoforo is the narrator and the producer of that. While it's made for kids, it really is wonderful for anybody to listen. All different topics are there, easier topics, more difficult topics, and it's a great program. Be the Bee. Anyway, the phrase "Be the Bee" comes from this story that St. Paisios told, and I'd like to share that with you. And Gary, you should like this as well.
I'm enjoying every word.
Very good. Gary is our resident beekeeper. And St. Paisios loved bees, by the way, and he loved all animals. There was not an animal he didn't like. He liked snakes. He liked all the animals, and all the animals seemed to like him too. So anyway, here's the story that I'm calling Be the Bee. Some people tell me that they are scandalized because they see many wrong things in the church. I tell them that if you ask a fly, are there any flowers in this area? It will say, I don't know about flowers, but over there in that heap of rubbish, you can find all the filth that you want. And it will go on to list all the unclean things it has been to. Now, if you ask a honeybee, have you seen any unclean things in the area? It will reply, unclean things? No, I've not seen any. The place here is full of the most fragrant flowers. And it will go on to name all the flowers of the garden or of the meadow. You see, the fly only knows where the unclean things are, while the honeybee knows where the beautiful iris or hyacinth is. As I've come to understand, some people resemble the honeybee, and some people resemble the fly. Those who resemble the fly seek to find evil in every circumstance and are preoccupied with it, and they don't see any good anywhere. But those who resemble the honeybee only see the good in everything they see. The person who has good thoughts, no matter what he sees, no matter what you tell him, maintains positive and good thoughts. So you remember at the beginning, this was someone came up to him complaining about the church and things that they saw in the church. And he says, let me tell you the story of the fly and the honeybee. And so really he's ending it with, to the person who asked, and I tell myself and I share with all of us, let's be the bee. We don't want to be the fly. We want to be the bee. Today is the feast of St. Paisios, the New of Mount Athos. Through his prayers, O Christ, have mercy upon us and save us. Amen. Christ is in our midst.